The only thing that gets you over imposter syndrome is actually doing the thing you want to be better at.
Figured out the how. It wasn't one person who did the murder, it was two. One to shoot and one to clean up. Now, which two people could have done it?
Now that's the million-dollar question. Who's the shooter and who's the cleanup man or woman in this murder? As we've got a murder to solve, as I'll be breaking down this 4th season of Only Murders in the Building, episode 5, spoilers ahead. As we open this episode with Marshall, the writer of the film, who we haven't seen since back in episode 1, as he talks about what makes a good writer, as he's standing in front of his mirror with some of who I assume are some of his favorite writers in Hollywood. Now in Marshall's opinion, it all starts with the look, as we see that he's taken his look from the acclaimed writer Charlie Kaufman, who also wrote the movie that the title of this episode is based upon. As we see that Marshall's look is made to make him look a certain way, because as he says, it's about convincing others that you have the goods. But regardless of the look, it all comes down to what's on the page, as we see him struggling to find a story and getting a movie actually made, but eventually he writes something that catches the right person's eye, and we see that that's Bev, the producer. But even after this victory, we see that his inner voice is telling him that he's still a fraud and this still may haunt him, but the real question is, who is the real Marshall and what secrets is he hiding? As we cut to picking up after the final moments of last week's episode, we see Bev claims that she didn't know who was in a room with her because the lights were off, as she apologizes for pointing a loaded gun at them. Now Bev is deflecting questions about her actually being a killer, but she does tell them,
"No, I did not. But I think someone on the movie may have."
Now, before moving on, this week's episode, being titled Adaptation, is based on a 2002 film, again, written by Charlie Kaufman, but also happens to star Meryl Streep. Now, I'll be honest with you all, I have yet to finish the film in its entirety, but for what I remember, Adaptation was a pretty solid movie. I do know that it did receive widespread critical acclaim for its direction, the screenplay, the humor, and actually Charlie Kaufman won some awards for the screenplay. Now, as it relates to this episode, the movie stars Nicolas Cage, who is playing Charlie Kaufman, who's having a hard time adapting a book. And the whole movie, again, from what I remember, is it's a bunch of stuff going on in his real life, some bizarre stuff going outside of his life, and he's really just having a hard time combining what he can do as a writer to what he's trying to do when his worlds collide. So as, again, it relates to this episode, we see Marshall struggling with the script. We also see other characters struggling to find out who they want to be. So there's some correlation going on that I'll tie into a little bit later. But back with the trio and Bev, we see that she has an alibi for the night of the murder, but she did receive a call from Saz, who left her a voicemail telling her,
"Name's Saz Spitaki, and I'm told you're the one to talk to. Look, I can't get into this in a message, but you need to call me, okay? There's a problem with your Only Murders movie. A big problem, and I can't say more than that."
Now, this voicemail came moments before her death, but the big question remains, what was this secret? What was the problem with the film? What was the sensitive information she wanted to tell Charles? That seems to be very important that we still haven't found out yet. But I do want to mention that if you do call that number that's on the screen now, it's not a number in service. Trust me, I called it. I was hoping that it secretly had some type of cool little Easter egg or maybe one of the characters giving us a clue. But again, the number leads nowhere. Now, Bev tells the trio that this movie has to be made, especially after passing on Barbie, and that the stakes are through the roof on this movie, and she claims that she came to this hideout to fix the problems of the film by looking into this murder herself. Now, I'm still not entirely sure how Bev knew about this hideout in Paradise in general, considering that it took Charles a whole episode of dreams and getting knocked out to find this actual location. So let me know in the comments below, do you all believe Bev's entire story? As the deal is in place that Bev will continue to do everything she can to keep this film on track, meanwhile the trio will find the murderer. Now, with this newfound information, we now have our third murder board assembled, but this time this is exclusively focused on the people involved in making this movie. Now, my favorite detective is back as Charles is trying to convince her that they're onto something with this new murder board, but also learning about the voicemail and also learning that someone that's working on the film could be the killer. In come Oliver and Mabel as Oliver's cracked the case on who the arm was in Loretta's IG post, and it's a gentleman by the name of Jack Junk. Now, we find out that Jack's actually playing Loretta's love interest in the show they're doing together, but we also find out that he's a former Olympic winner. Now, one would consider an Olympian to be in tip-top world-class shape. We'll discuss that more a little bit later in the breakdown. Now, we see the trio's got their first check after selling their life's rights, but now, let me ask you all this. This was definitely probably posed as a joke from Charles, but the whole he has to reach out to his accountant who's in Belize because Charles doesn't want to pay taxes, again, I think it's a joke, but should we be looking out on Charles with this whole tax invasion potential situation? Let me know what's going on with Charles in the comments below. But we've known for a while now that Mabel's been struggling to find her purpose since the beginning of this very show. Well, it looks like she's finally found her way, as she's now going to be going by a podcast producer. Now, in the meantime, Detective Williams will be investigating the gun that Bev used while the crew heads upstairs to hopefully take some names off the new murder board. Now, I want to backtrack for a second. The gun that was used by Bev, there's got to be something there because they're making it out to be something important. Will there be useful information from this gun? Is it registered under someone that has some type of importance to her story? Share your thoughts on if this gun will be key in solving this case in the comments below. As they arrive upstairs, they immediately see the brother-sisters being weird as they normally are, as they come up with the idea to include the trio in this naked photo shoot for marketing of the film. Now, as they head into the elevator, the show makes it a point to show us a suitcase that they're carrying, which to me makes me wonder what this case is used for, and if you ask me, it's a perfectly good case for a sniper rifle. Again, the way the camera wants us to see the case makes me think that it's meant to make us think that it's being used as a weapon, but more times than not, it's probably going to be used as a misdirect. Now, it looks like Howard's audition last week wasn't a total disaster, as we now see that he's working on a production team. Now, I got to point out, the laugh of the week for me in this week's episode has to be Charles. His subtle way of pretending to be on the phone while actually taking photos the wrong way initially on his phone was hilarious, but it also comes in the clutch a little bit later. In a room full of potential suspects, how will they find the killer? Well, they find the one person who stands out, and that is Marshall, whose foot gets stuck on the sticky mat, which will end up being this week's key item of importance. Now, Marshall initially was nervous to talk to the trio, but switches up really quickly when he finds out that he might be a suspect on their list, and that they're not actually approaching him to make changes to the script. Now, I could be reading this scene wrong, but I feel like Marshall's happiness comes from the fact that the trio didn't call him out from him not being who he actually says he is. I mean, hell, early in this episode, he called himself a fraud. So I feel like that whole fraud mentality, imposter syndrome, will be resurfacing later on for this character in this season. Now, they want to talk to Marshall back at Charles's place. Now, I said it back in episode 1, and I'm going to say it again, that we should definitely be keeping an eye on Marshall, especially after this episode, because I just go back to episode 1 when he said that he was like a fly on the wall. And again, I just asked myself, we haven't seen the research process of him getting to know the trio's behaviors, how they're going to react, how they're going to do certain things. So again, Marshall is one of my key suspects, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into him by the end of this breakdown. Now, while this is happening, we see Bev pulls Mabel aside from the crew as Mabel is gift basket the opportunity to get into meeting the head of the podcasting division of her company. Now, this wasn't fully realized in this episode, but definitely setting up the future plot for her having her own solo podcast one day, something I've been talking about since last season. But also, I gotta point out, is it me or is Bev constantly trying to appease Mabel? Whether it be her giving her whatever the dollar amount she wants for her life rights to do the film, this actual conversation that we're seeing take place. Again, I don't think Bev is the killer, and I'll express that a little bit later, but there is something off about her, and her moments with Mabel come off like she's trying to distract her. But again, I do think this is all just setting up Mabel's subplot of her finally finding out who she wants to be outside the trio and solve these murders, and her kind of finding her purpose. As we see, Ben's double drops off a thank you gift for helping him get a gig on the film as the trio interrogate Marshall, who tell them that he was doing an observational stand-up on the night of the murder. Now, we have this moment where Mabel calls out Marshall for having a fake beard, and he admits to her that it is fake, and he actually does this because it goes into his look, but also he can't grow real facial hair, as him and Mabel bond over feeling like they're imposters sometime. Now, right now, Marshall's act seems to be working on the trio as they show him their murder board, and I definitely think that he's playing the part so well. Now, I want you all to listen to these lines, and they may be lines of importance.
These aren't really their IF 2010 vision. Flailing their way to success. You haven't missed.
So he has perfect vision, and he mentioned he's not missing. So yeah, a person having perfect vision, that would be something that you would think would help a sniper having to shoot someone in the middle of the night, right? And also the lines of not missing sounds like something a shooter would say. Again, Marshall has my attention since the very start of the season. And again, he's definitely one of my top suspects in this murder case. Now, playing the role, we see Marshall points out the timing inconsistencies as Charles wants to prove him wrong by putting us through the mind of a killer as he pitches his version of how it all went down. As we see Charles playing a Bond-like character in his pitch idea as we get this story through a very cinematic lens. Again, playing along, we see Marshall describes a very physically fit person in order to do everything that Charles' movie just entailed. Now, throughout this episode, we see Oliver struggling to hear all the good things said about Junk, especially when it comes to his physicality. Now, being in competition with Junk in this episode, we see Oliver stands in to play the killer to prove Charles' theory to be true. As we watch, poor Oliver tries his best as he's yelling at kids, and he actually runs to the famous tennis player John McEnroe as he comes in super late on Charles' theory. Again, Charles' theory isn't sticking true as Mabel notices one of the photos show a match of a person's shoe print matching the one found at Dudenoff's place, making this a huge opportunity to find the killer at the photo shoot. Now dressed in their season 1 outfits, they arrive to the photo shoot to find the other actors who's portraying them as well as their doubles in this room of mirrors creating illusions. As the plan is set in motion, which is to use Eva Longoria's dust particle mats to find the person's shoe prints found earlier. Now I have to point this out, this could be absolutely nothing or it could be something very important. In the scene where we see Oliver looking over the script with the other Oliver, you'll notice on the side of them, Ben standing there, the double, right? And on the screen, he's getting like yanked away and there's some commotion going on off screen. Now, again, it could be nothing. It could be the Ben double freaking out over the rats like we've seen him do 1,000 times, which again, I think him doing this whole rat thing means something to the character and has a metaphor for something that I talked about last week. But did he get switched out at that moment with his own double? Again, rewatch the scene. He's on the screen. He gets pulled away. Again, it could be him reacting to the rats like he's done this episode and last week. Or he could have been pulled away, again, by his own double, the double having his own double. Now, as Charles is getting his makeup redone, he runs to Eugene as he says that they're dancing, which sparks the it's 2 people involved in a murder theory as Charles tells Mabel,
I figured out the how. It wasn't one person who did the murder, it was 2.
Now, you notice the camera pans over and we see all these different background actors who have their own doubles, which really this show is leaning to the idea that there are 2 killers involved going on. As their plan to track the killer's footprints leads them to the brother's sisters, one of the sisters tells the other to move Oliver because he's missed his mark as they pick him up and put him in a perfect position. As we end this episode with showing a scene being played out with the shot from the trailer showing that it was a brother-sister committing the murder as the tiny sister at the photo shoot is now missing and a shot is now being fired and you can hear someone saying that they've been shot. If you go back and re-listen to that scene, you can hear someone say that they've been shot. Now obviously it's super hard to point out who voice that is with all the commotion going on. But I go back to Oliver being moved. So if it's not Oliver that said that, then it might be Zach Galifianakis or it might be Ben himself. But I believe 1 of 3, if not maybe all 3 of them, got shot in this moment. Which now brings us to taking a look at my suspect list after watching this episode. Now let's start off with my Ben theory. Now in my mind, how this might work, we get a revenge death story of sorts which explains Ben's return. First off, we can't forget about the beef that Ben had with Charles all those years ago when Ben first got into acting, and you would imagine as Ben's stunt double that he probably knew about the story and probably had a grudge against Charles himself. So would have been stuntman Ben, who's now out of a job, heard about the movie being made, and obviously Saz was playing Charles's double, but in some form of desperation, he killed her. But again, going back to my theory about Ben's stunt double last week and him seeing these rats being a metaphor of a rat being assigned to stuntman community and a stuntman being involved in the murder. Let's play the idea that there are 2 killers, who I do believe that there were 2 killers involved in the murder, which is something that the show's been doing since season 2, having 2 killers being involved. So let's take that idea and talk about the strength idea of someone being physically fit, which was something they kept mentioning throughout this episode. So let's start off with Helga and Rudy being a killer combo. We don't know much about her, but we know that she threatened to kill the trio when we were first introduced to her. We also know that she is said to be strange and odd and not to be a good influence on Rudy, which, speaking of, we know that he wasn't accounted for during the murder, and most importantly, He's a fit person. He fits the bill for being in shape because we know he's a fitness influencer. Now let's talk about TV's new hit couple, and that is Loretta and Junk. Now let's take a look at Meryl Streep, the actress, first. Her joining the show was big news because obviously she's one of the greatest actors of all time. But then just looking at it from what we gotten so far, Meryl Streep just being used as a love interest for Oliver and only being used sparingly. Now to me, this makes me think that why would someone of her caliber just take this very limited role to begin with? So what if Meryl Streep as Loretta, what if she is one of the killers? Again, I just keep thinking to myself, there has to be more to her story than just being a love interest of Oliver. Again, just going back to when we first met the character, thinking about her early days of starting off as an actress, and you would imagine that she probably came across a Sass or a Charles, and maybe she had a bad experience with them, and maybe now she's getting her revenge. Now let's take a look at the second component of this killer combo, and that's the junk of it all. Now this episode very much made it seem to be like this character is going to probably be used just to make Oliver jealous, but the overt signs of how fit Junk is and how he gets women and how it just seems so on the nose and how they're playing to that particular angle. Now, very similar to Rudy, we know that Junk is said to be in super good shape. Again, we know that the idea is that the person that shot from the west side of the building, there was no way that they could have made it to the east side in so limited amount of time. So again, the idea would be Loretta was the one that took the shot and he was the cleanup person. And the whole idea behind him being a player, what if they're switching the tables? What if instead Loretta's the one who's running things, and that's how we get this Loretta being the shooter and Junk being the cleanup man? Now, the obvious answer after watching this episode is taking a look at the brothers sisters. Based on their odd behavior, the case that looks perfect for a rifle, and the ending of this episode, all the signs are pointing towards them. But I hate to use this card, but it is the middle of the season. It's the midway point. It's the mid-season finale. To me, there's no way that they're going to reveal this so soon in the season. I still just can't figure out why would they kill Zaz. Like, what would be the reason? What did they do to scare her? What was the secret they had? Again, the reason I'm kind of dismissive on the brother sisters, and I'm going to even throw Bev in this conversation, is because shows kind of used that card before. They used that last season. We know that the producers were the killers. So I just don't feel like the show would do this again, where this time it's the producers and the director, or just a director. So I don't feel as though Bev or the brother sisters are the killers. But again, I'll play along for now, and as I'll talk about with next week's description, it sounds like we're going to get a little bit more information and backstory on the brother sisters. Now lastly, I don't have a set duo, but I definitely believe that someone in the stunt community will be involved in this murder. Whether that's Ben, like I mentioned earlier, or the chiropractor Mandy, who I mentioned last week, I just feel like someone in the stunt community will be revealed to be involved in this murder. But my number one, based on this particular episode and also based on how I felt about him in episode 1, my number one suspect right now is Marshall. To me, the opening just tells us so much. He's pretending to be a writer. He's faking it all. He's faking it just to make it. What if he's not a writer, but he's a killer posing as one? Just take a look back at all the moments he had with our trio in this episode. I know I can hear it in the comments now, but Elliot, he was the one that technically gave Charles the hunch that maybe 2 people were involved in this murder. And yes, I do agree with you there, but stick with me here. He's just coming off too helpful for me in this episode. He's only doing this to keep them off his trail. I mean, damn, Charles, he pretty much gave him all the evidence they've gotten so far with showing them the murder boards, and it's evidence that is very useful for the actual killer to keep track of what they've discovered so far. I feel as though he's playing a role, and he's playing it pretty damn well. Again, I think about those times when you say he's a fly on the wall. How does he know so much about the trio without actually spending time with them prior to this episode? So the big question is, why? What is his reasonings? That's the big question, if indeed Marshall is to be revealed to be the killer. Now, I do want to point out one of the underlying themes I took away from this episode is the ideas of doubles and illusions and pretending to be someone else, followed by last week's theme of being a stuntman and pretending to be someone else. This, again, to me, last week's episode and this week's episode, they're pointing us towards someone isn't who they say they are. And right now, whether it be Marshall or Dudenoff, I think that that will be a key reveal when it comes to that moment of showing us who the actual killer or killers are. Now, overall, I thought this was a much better episode than last week. This did a better better job of showcasing the genius comedic moments of all these amazing actors and these different characters that we have in the show, but also adding more depth to the murder mystery and giving us more clues and giving us more to chew on than last week's episode. Now, to take a look ahead, next week's episode is titled Blow Up, and the synopsis reads, a documentary film is being made by the brothers sisters. Now, it's a safe assumption to assume that next week will focus heavily on those siblings to show us their backstory and most likely show us why they are or aren't the actual killers. That's going to end this week's breakdown of Only Murders in the Building. It is now your turn to go in the comments and discuss everything that we talked about in this breakdown video, but more importantly, share your deeper meanings, your bigger takeaways, your Easter eggs, your theories that you all have come up with after watching this episode. What do you think about Marshall? What do you think about the brothers sisters? What do you think about Ben? What do you think about everything we talked about? Let's talk about it all in the comments below. Now, as always, if you stuck around to this point in the video, I can't thank you enough. If you are still here, do me a favor, put in the comments now, #illusion. Now, of course, I'll be back to discuss episode 6, so if you all appreciate these breakdowns, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up, share this video to anyone and everyone you know that loves talking about the show just as much as we do, and consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell notification. You all are amazing, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.